Alright guys, so now we're going to talk about evolution and the history of evolution, where it came from. We'll mention Charles Darwin and discuss how he came up with this theory, as well as his theory of natural selection and what evidence we have that supports that it is in fact real. We'll start by introducing two terms that you've probably heard before, camouflage and mimicry. Have you ever looked at an organism and noticed that it blended perfectly in with their environment? Well, that's what camouflage is, and this has happened because of millions and millions of years of evolution that has allowed this creature to look so similar to things in its environment. And it's allowed it to blend in and have an evolutionary advantage over other individuals in the same environment. Mimicry is a little bit different. Mimicry is when one species has evolved to look so similar to another. So if you look below here, you can see that on the left is a monarch butterfly. Monarch butterflies are poisonous, and some animals, such as birds, get sick when they eat them. Viceroy butterflies, which is the picture to the right, look extremely similar to the monarchs, except they don't produce the same toxins that the monarchs produce. So if a bird comes to eat this butterfly, being a viceroy, although it doesn't actually have any toxins, the bird might avoid it thinking that it is going to get sick by eating it. So that's how mimicry can provide a real evolutionary advantage over other organisms in the same area. If you look to the right, there are a couple examples with two different types of snakes, as well as a moth on the bottom right. That's a moth's pattern mimicking the eyes of an owl, which could scare away some predators. So now we'll discuss natural selection. This theory was proposed by Charles Darwin back in the late 1800s. What he did, you can see here in the upper right, he took a voyage with actually the English Navy on the HMS Beagle, and this voyage by the Navy was meant to circumnavigate the globe and produce map charters for England. Well, Darwin, along their travels, he decided to take scientific research and collect data on the different organisms that he saw throughout the world. And while he was on this voyage, he came up with this idea of natural selection and this idea of evolution, and really put it into words. So what natural selection is, Darwin stated that some species that will survive will have advantages of specific traits that are better suited for a specific environment that they live in. And those individuals with these traits have a higher likelihood to survive and then pass their DNA down to their offspring. So what we see is that these traits that are advantageous are more likely to be seen in future generations. Those without these advantages, without these traits that give them an advantage, they would die and therefore not pass their genes on to the next generation. And that's what natural selection is. Natural selection is nature selecting the individuals that are best suited for the environment. Darwin studied many organisms throughout his voyage, but the one place that Darwin found the most useful evidence was in the Galapagos Island, where he studied a group of finches. What he noticed was that this group of finches, they all looked very similar, but their beaks were shaped very differently based on the available food. And this was dependent on what food could grow on these different parts of the Galapagos Island and where these birds inhabited. And what he proposed was that all of these birds came from one common ancestor of finch that had gotten blown over to the island by a storm. And later research had proved that he was correct. And all of these finches had evolved different shaped beaks depending on where they lived in their environment. Tortoises were another organism that he studied quite a bit, and by looking at their different shell shapes, he figured out that they all had slightly different mechanisms that made them similar but different from each other. Here are some steps on natural selection and explaining how these species can evolve over, again, long periods of time. When we're talking about evolution, we're talking about these organisms evolving over thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of years. And no single organism can evolve. This isn't like Pokemon. Instead, it is going to be that these tiny changes are seen over generations and generations and generations. And eventually, over, again, extremely long periods of time, these organisms slowly, or populations of these organisms, can slowly change. So when we're looking at the first step of natural selection, individuals in a population show differences. If we look here at the example shown below, we see that some beetles are green and some beetles are brown. You can look around the room and you can see that we all have differences, and some of these differences may provide an evolutionary advantage over others. Specifically, like in this case, when we're talking about color of an organism, this might provide an organism with an advantage of camouflage and hiding from predators, or maybe it's able to hide to be a more successful predator to catch its prey. So these two in particular have a very great impact. Next is that the organisms that have more offspring then can survive. So, for example, green beetles tend to get eaten by birds because they do not hide as well. And so they don't survive and have offspring, while the brown beetles are able to camouflage more and they're able to have offspring. Now, all of these offspring aren't going to reach adulthood and reproduce. So the brown ones in this case have an advantage over the green ones because they're able to stay hidden better from these predators. The next part of natural selection is that variations in a population are inherited from their parents. The surviving brown beetles have brown baby beetles because this trait has a genetic basis. So we learned a couple chapters ago that we get our DNA from our parents, and these genes are passed down to the next generation. So if the brown beetles were successful and they were the ones passing down their traits, well, the only traits or color that they are able to pass down in this case would be brown. The only way that it would pass down a different color is if there was some sort of recessive trait that wasn't physically being expressed in their phenotype, but they still had the genetics for it. As we said earlier, some of these variations are going to increase the success that these organisms have at reproducing and passing down their traits to the next generation. The better the trait, in this case the brown allele for the color, allows the beetles to have more offspring and become more common in the population over time. If this process continues, eventually all of the individuals in the population will be brown. If you look here, this has resulted in many different phenotypes. So if you look at the picture of the ladybugs in the top left, you can see here that these ladybugs all have different variation here. They have different colored spots, different shaped spots. Some have more darker shells, others have lighter shells. And to know which one of these ladybugs is the most successful, we really can't answer it. We have to first find out what the environment looks like. If it was a very dark environment, well, this dark ladybug would be really successful because it would be able to blend in with its surroundings. However, if it was sitting on sand, this really dark ladybug would be at a great disadvantage. It would easily be seen by predators sticking out on the sand, while the lighter ladybug might blend in more with the environment. So it's really the environment that chooses which of these organisms is going to be successful and pass those traits on to the next generation. If we look at the bottom right, you can see here we have a bunch of puppies, and we have different variation in colors. Now, we're going to start talking a little bit about not natural selection, but artificial selection, and how humans can actually control which traits are passed down to the next generation, if these traits are desirable. So next, while looking at survival of the fittest, survival of the fittest means that an adaptation is a trait that increases the fitness of an individual, and adaptations can be physical or behavioral. Fitness is the contribution an individual makes to the next generation, and this is relative to the contribution that others have made. Basically saying, guys, individuals who are more fit will be able to leave more offspring for the next generation. So being physically fit, it doesn't necessarily mean the strongest individual or the biggest individual. Instead, it means the most fit for the environment or the best suited for that environment. So that could be, for example, blending in with the environment, or maybe there's a behavioral advantage that makes them more attractive to mate with and reproduce. So there are other different ones than just camouflage to remember. Evolution by natural selection occurs when a population of organisms changes or adapts over time as a result of individuals with inheritable traits leaving more offspring than the other individuals. If you look here, this is exactly what I was talking about a few minutes ago when I said that it depends on the environment. In this really light environment, the brown mouse really stands out on the bottom. But if you look at the top, you can barely see that brown mouse or tan-colored mouse that is hiding amongst the rocks. If the environment changes, though, for example, maybe there's a volcanic eruption, you can see here now that the mouse that has the darker fur color has a great advantage over the lighter colored mouse. So the environment is going to dictate which of these individuals' traits are more successful and which individuals have a better chance of surviving over the others. But it's important to note that the environment can change, and traits that were initially advantageous might not be advantageous in a future environment. If we look here, this praying mantis, for example, has evolved to drastically camouflage in with its environment. It looks exactly similar to the flowers that it is hiding in. So how this happens is that at one point, it's not like one day there was just a pink praying mantis. At some point, there was a praying mantis that was more pink than the other ones, or more similar to blending into this flower. And it had an advantage over the other praying mantises, and what happened was, although those got eaten, this one was able to reproduce. And over time, the next generation, the ones that looked the most like this flower, were the ones that survived and reproduced, while the ones that didn't were the ones that were eaten and did not pass their genes on to the next generation. And that process happened again and again and again, eventually leading to these organisms to look so similar to their environment. We call this descent with modification. And what that means is that as an organism evolves, there's only small changes that are happening inside of the organism over extremely long periods of time. You might not have known this, but whales actually evolved from a wolf-like creature that used to live in the deserts of Africa. And what happened was this organism as it began to hunt in the waters, the ones that were able to swim better had an advantage over the ones that were unable to swim as well. And again, over millions and millions of years, we can see that the evolution of this wolf-like creature slowly evolved away from having legs to then having fins. And again, it's not like the whale had any control over this. These were just random mutations that happened that were advantageous and allowed this organism to have a better chance of survival over others. Next, we'll talk about artificial selection. And artificial selection is the intentional reproduction of individuals in a population that have desirable traits. One of the best examples of this is dogs. If you look, we have all different uses of dogs if you go back in the history. For example, some dogs were bred to intimidate, such as the Doberman Pinscher. Others were bred to fight, like the Bulldog. And others were bred for their cuteness, such as the King Cavalier, who was bred not only for its cuteness, but also for its good temperament. Golden Retrievers as well. They always pick the best individuals with the most desirable traits, and those are the ones that get bred and pass their genes on more often. So because of that, we've now seen all these different dog breeds. Farm animals work in the same way. If a farmer goes, they take the biggest and healthiest, strongest sheep or cows that they then breed and are going to then have the likelihood that all of these really good traits that these individuals have are then passed down to the next generation. And that happens over and over and over again. And what happens is eventually you have these organisms that are exactly how you want them, because you are choosing the genes that are getting passed down to the next generation. This is actually how we got all of these vegetables here. All of these vegetables: broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kale, kohlrabi. All of these came from a wild type of mustard that, with certain traits, they were able to artificially select them and artificially pollinate these wild mustard plants with certain ones in order to eventually lead to the production or the evolution of these different types of vegetables. The last example of artificial selection that I have is this is actually how we domesticated the dogs from ancestral canines. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in class and hopefully watch a video clip that will explain that a little bit.